Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 26, and I am the co-host of the show, Kyle Anslone. I'm joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
Kyle, good. How's it going tonight?
Not too bad. We got a lot of news to talk about: Afghanistan, Libya, Sudan. Very important stories, although probably nothing really getting much headline time, as we're about a week out from the election now. So we'll be talking about the stuff that the mainstream media isn't on today's show. Make sure you share the show if you're listening. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute or on YouTube. The show page there is Conflicts of Interest. Make sure you subscribe to the show and check out the cool stuff we're doing over on the video half of the feed. And with that, Will, let's get into this. The first story we had today is about Afghanistan, and I think the main story we had that we were going to go off of was this U.S. airstrike kills five Taliban members as they carried out another airstrike to defend the Afghan National Army. This is something that we've really been documenting, Will, on the show, is the Afghan peace deal and then potential violations of it on either side, and just the updates going on in Afghanistan and at the peace talks in Qatar. And so here we have another example of a U.S. airstrike, which seems to be another breach of the deal, as this wasn't an airstrike carried out to defend U.S. troops or even maybe NATO forces, which I think is somewhat outlined in the agreement for the Americans to continue to do that. But rather, this airstrike seemed to be directed at the Taliban, just in defense of them generally, or not in defense of the Taliban, in defense of the Afghan government, which I think would be a violation of the treaty, at least as I understand it. And this comes just like within the week of the U.S. tweeting out through the spokesman of the general for U.S. Combat in Afghanistan, Scott Miller, saying that we're resetting the treaty. And so, Will, what do you think of all this? And is this a possible real blow to the peace agreement with the Taliban?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. This came just like like a week or a week and a half after we had that alleged. We covered it on the show, the so-called reset of the deal, where Zalmay Khalilzad, one of the top commanders on the U.S. side, went and sat down with Taliban leadership and apparently agreed that they were going to try to observe the deal more carefully and like not strike each other. As far as I understand, the Taliban hasn't been launching attacks on the U.S. side. Like U.S. officials, I think, have repeatedly said that they are holding up their end of the deal. But the thing is, the Taliban are not withdrawn or like withholding attacks on the Afghan government and Afghan forces, and that's not, as far as I understand, that is not like that wasn't spelled out under the deal. That they, it was. I think it was understood that the Taliban would continue to launch attacks on the government, but lately the U.S. has been stepping up apparently retaliatory strikes, trying to help to support the Afghan government. But it would seem to me that is a violation of the deal. I mean, that is, it's clearly a direct strike on Taliban fighters. So, you would think that that would violate the language of the agreement. Now, as we covered on when we talked about the reset, it's like the language of the agreement says stuff about how the Taliban has to withhold or stop attacks on U.S. allies, but it's not totally clear how they define that. Like typically a U.S. ally is somebody who has like a treaty, like a treaty defense cooperation, with the U.S. Whereas the Afghan government certainly doesn't have anything like that. We're not mutual defense partners. But I guess the U.S. could get away with saying that, oh yeah, they're our partner and they're our, in a way they're our ally. So I don't know. I guess that is how they're going to try to sell these strikes as not violating the deal.
I hear you. I'm not surprised. It just seems weak, because the Afghan, the part of the all the deal making the U.S. had done with the Taliban, including the big prisoner swap, which we had talked about on, I think, mainly foreign policy focus and not conflicts of interest, because it was close or done by this time. Was the point to start talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And I read this week that is not going so well over in Qatar, that they're feeling like they haven't made the progress that they expected that they would make. I'm not sure exactly where they are, if they're even talking about like on the ground issues right now, trying to draw up maps or political agreements. And the Taliban have kind of voiced that they're not looking for like a ceasefire with the Afghan government right now, but rather a political deal first before a ceasefire on the ground. So with all that, it seems pretty obvious that that it really never was in the agreement that the Afghan government and the Taliban were gonna stop fighting. Also, the Taliban at least have claimed in the past that they were just carrying out responses to Afghan government offensive operations, right? And so
Right.
I'm not sure how you could possibly have this peace deal, or why the Taliban would have ever signed on to. Peace deal is a pretty bad term for it, but why they would have signed on to this agreement if it meant that Afghan government got to carry out offensive operations, and then when they tried to retake territory, they were bombed by the United States. That definitely wasn't the
Right.
deal.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't see them agreeing to that. I mean, there were reports of like certain things that we might not have seen, like secret annexes of the deal. So I guess there's a possibility there are things that we don't know about. But yeah, I couldn't see the Taliban agreeing to something like that.
Right. The other story from Afghanistan, a big headline this week, was there was a Islamic State attack on the education center in Kabul. The last time I read that, it had killed up to 30 people, including several students. And this is just a continuing problem in Afghanistan. And then the other headline, which I think ties into this, is that we have found out that the U.S. has actually carried out some airstrikes in support of the Taliban in their fight against the Islamic State Khorasan group in Afghanistan. And so at the same time, we're like fighting this endless war against the Taliban. We're also, carrying out airstrikes in support of them. And, you know, uh, I'm not saying it's completely absurd to, think that the Islamic State Khorasan faction there is a bigger threat to whatever extent to like Westerners or the U.S. My guess is at this point that they're the most likely to target something like a sports game, education center, or international buildings within the Kabul area where the diplomats and stuff stay. I don't know what the Kabul Green Zone is called, but that area.
Yeah, me either.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I just thought that was a pretty crazy omission that we found out this week, that the U.S. was actually supporting the Taliban at the same time we're actually trying to, bomb them too.
Yeah, I mean, the story is kind of ironic and like in some ways just outrageous that like, we're fighting this 2 decade long war against this group. And meanwhile, we're also helping them, against their own enemies because, oh, we happen to share, those same enemies. Like, I think this is not like there've been like other indications that the US does this before. I think this Washington Post report we got like this week was the most clear one. But I think even like the commander of CENTCOM, General Frank McKenzie, he actually told the House Armed Services Committee back in March, like he kind of let it slip. I don't know if he meant to say this, but he did say that like the U.S. would do limited things to help the Taliban against the Islamic State. But now we have more like detail. This has kind of been fleshed out more in this report, about how we're flying these sorties. Like we see, we'll be. It's not that we're in direct communication with the Taliban. It's more like we're watching them fight. We're watching a battle between them and the Islamic State, and we'll strategically bomb to let the Taliban advance or maneuver in a particular case. But it's pretty funny. The Post interviewed a few soldiers, like not like military brass, but like soldiers, like troops on the ground, including a special forces guy. And they were saying that like the unit that was in charge of these missions, they called it the Taliban Air Force. So like they're very explicit about what they're doing here, about helping the Taliban. I just that's I find that ironic. But one potential silver lining, I wanted to run this by you. Maybe you think this is outrageous or just like a crazy idea. But I do wonder if like this is, I don't know, this is something that could be a silver lining that like the Taliban and the Afghan government, this could maybe be like a common interest of theirs of fighting against the Islamic State. And I wonder if this kind of thing could sort of like going forward in the talks, if this could be something they could find common ground on, because God knows they need it. There's like the last I had read, they're like still arguing about like whether Hanafi Islam should like guide the negotiations or, like just like the basic framework of it. And so it doesn't sound like they're making a lot of progress. And it sounds like they could use some common ground. And this seems like, one obvious place. They both don't like the Islamic State.
Yeah, well, in the Islamic State is carrying out like attacks again against this education center in Kabul.
Right.
It's a pretty horrific thing that the Afghan government, I guess, actually may be interested in teaming up with the Taliban to curb something like that. I guess, have they been making a little bit more progress at the talks? That would have seemed a lot more possible to me. In fact,
Right.
I would just guess that it would be easier for the U.S. and the Taliban to do this, on a more like actual coordinated basis rather than the Afghan government getting involved in it, just because of how much like intra-Afghan hatred there really seems to be,
Right.
and how deep the disputes go, to the fact that they really can't even figure out like how to sit down now. I really think that the only thing the U.S. could do to like accelerate talks would be to like make it clear to the Afghan government, like, you better make some kind of deal with these guys, or else we're gonna leave and it's gonna be still ongoing war situation. So
Right.
I guess that's the only place where I would have optimism, if it looked like the U.S. was actually making a real push here. Will,
Right.
anything else on Afghanistan?
No, I didn't have a whole lot of detail on that one. I just, I thought that story about us helping the Taliban is very ironic and like revealing, I guess.
Yeah, no, it definitely is, and it's one of those stories that it feels like in a normal election cycle, maybe something huge that both candidates are talking about in the week leading up to the election, whether Donald Trump's peace talks with the Taliban have netted an actual deal, and then is the U.S. supporting the Taliban? That, I mean, that seems like something that a lot of Americans could be shocked by. And yeah,
Right. Right.
it's not even like the smallest. It might not even make on anybody's news ticker, on
Right.
any of the other shows. So,
Yeah.
very interesting. Well, let's take a second here to thank our sponsor, Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde makes great CBD products and quality CBD products. My favorite part about getting my CBD from Paloma Verde is that the quality and the dosing is gonna be consistent. So the CBD that I take has the same effect on me every time, which is just absolutely fantastic. And one of the reasons that I wasn't a big fan of CBD before, you get those gummy worms at the head shop, and sometimes it feels like you got a truckload of it, and other times you think you just got a $10 gummy worm. So check out Paloma Verde CBD store, palomaverdestore.com, and get your CBD there. Again, that's palomaverdestore.com. Links are in the show notes at YouTube and at the Libertarian Institute, so easy find the link there. After you get all of your CBD products, you type in the promo code PEACE at checkout, and you get 25% off. Again, check out Paloma Verde store.com, get your CBD, promo code PEACE for 25% off. Will, let's get back to the show.
Let's do it.
All right, next up here, I got a little map up of Libya showing some of the territorial lines there, and just the ongoing civil war that we now reportedly have a ceasefire of. I don't know how long you can actually say this particular part of the civil war has been going on. I don't know, maybe like 2014's a decent mark for that time or something like that. But really, since Obama went in there and kicked the whole thing over and murdered Gaddafi with that NATO-led intervention, the country's been more or less a failed state. So, Will, what are our current updates on the ground in Libya?
Yeah, yeah. So we haven't really devoted that much time to Libya on this show yet, because like the conflict there has kind of like been on and off like since we launched in August. But you covered Libya a lot on your old show, Foreign Policy Focus, so people can go back and see that you covering that for years. But yeah, we did get a pretty big development there last Friday, one of the biggest ones I've seen there in a while. As you said, the two sides, the UN-backed Government of National Accord, the GNA, and then also the forces loyal to General Khalifa Haftar and what's called the Libyan National Army, or the LNA, they have finally worked out what they are calling a permanent ceasefire on Friday that was brokered by the United Nations. And just like some major provisions of the ceasefire include them they're going to have all their frontline fighters return to their bases just to sort of immediately de-escalate the conflict. And apparently that started. I think the UN said that process had begun. I'm not totally sure how far along they are with that, but apparently people have started to return, have started to leave the front lines. And then they're also calling for the withdrawal of all foreign mercenaries within 3 months. I think they said by January. Because like we've seen all kinds of foreign fighters being shipped into Libya. I think from like 9 different countries now, at least that they've been able to document these foreign fighters are coming from. Like Turkey, for example, they back the GNA, the Government of National Accord, based in Tripoli, and they've sent in Syrian fighters that they've been arming and supporting for a long time in the Syrian civil war. And then also the Russians and the Egyptians and the UAE, I think they've also all sent in mercenaries or advisors, or have gotten involved in one way or another. So it's a pretty crowded, like diverse field. There's a lot of foreign mercenaries, and so part of the deal is to apparently send them all home within 3 months, and they think that'll help to like de-escalate things a lot. Um, but also under this deal, I think they've agreed, and this was like the most impressive part of it to me, that they even were able to agree to this. But I've read that they agreed to form a single military force from like the two sides, and so that I think would be like a massive feat to pull off. If successful, that would be like a huge change in Libya. I think it would like signify a whole new situation there if you have like a joint military command that have agreed to exist under one roof. I'm not really sure how likely that is to actually work, or how long that'll take to work out. I guess that we'll have to kind of wait and see. But that does seem like a very promising, if not lofty, goal of this whole this agreement here. And also, in addition to that, I think they're also setting up a joint police force too. They're going to move into like the areas where the fighters withdraw from, and secure and hold those areas as part of this deal. And we should say there have been several other attempts to hammer out similar ceasefires in Libya to like end the fighting there before. But those have fallen apart for various reasons. Obviously, if they're still fighting, if they have been up until last Friday. And it is possible that'll happen again, that this new deal will fall apart. But this time, at least in my estimation, it seems like the war is kind of ground to more of a stalemate than it was in previous, junctures. So that may mean there's a better chance for this thing to succeed, with neither side like in a really great position to be grabbing a whole bunch of new territory or whatever. Khalifa Haftar, the guy in command of the LNA, he was like once a CIA asset, and he's now backed by the UAE and Egypt, I think, and Russia to some extent. I believe anyway. But he tried this huge offensive on Tripoli starting last spring, where they pushed into the suburbs of the city. They took like the airport and all this stuff. It was a pretty big offensive. But over this last summer, the GNA was able to like force them to withdraw, and they regained full control of the city. Which may have had something to do with like Turkey stepping up its support for the GNA, because like at some point they started increasing that, and it seemed to have had some effect in the battlefield. But as far as I understand, that has been like the biggest thing to happen in this war over the last few months, is this like GNA counterattack that forced Haftar to give up his big offensive on Tripoli. But I don't think that brought the war any closer to ending, because it if anything, that only made it go longer. It had Haftar had this big decisive victory over the GNA's capital, then that may have brought things a few steps closer to a conclusion. But it seems like after that offensive failed on Tripoli, it seems like things have kind of been at a stalemate. I know there's been some fighting near Sirte recently over like the oil-rich areas around there in north central Libya. But as far as I understand, there too, there's been sort of a standoff, and there hasn't been a whole lot of progress on either side. So what I'm saying is, I think this ceasefire does seem to be like the best chance they've had in quite a while to finally bring this thing to a close. Like the goals they've set up seem pretty lofty, and like maybe some of them are unrealistic, like forming that joint force. And I expect there will be all kinds of speed bumps in this process. But as things stand now, the two sides have agreed to what they are calling a permanent ceasefire, and it seems like they intend to make good on it. I think they're supposed to meet next month in Tunisia to like keep negotiating. So there is like a process set up.
Yeah. Well, so it sounds like some good news here, Will, which isn't something we usually have to talk about when it comes to Libya. A lot of the stuff, as you mentioned, I've talked about in Foreign Policy Focus, was what it meant for Libya to become a failed state, the return of slavery and slave trade in Libya. But probably almost worse was the human trafficking, the kidnapping, the torturing. I think it was either BuzzFeed or the Daily Beast documented this story of a guy who was trying to, I believe, get from Nigeria to Europe and attempted to go through Libya. And, after the first guy he paid to take him, put him in a cage and called his family and tortured him and forced his family to give him thousands of whatever. I have no idea what the conversion rate would be. But thousands of whatever currency was in play at the time. And rather than releasing the guy or actually taking him to Europe or even back to his family, they sold him to another guy who did the same thing. And this happened like 3 times. It's just like absurd situations like that the humanitarian situation in Libya is now bad. Where, before Gaddafi, is a monster and has problems, and I wouldn't like to live under Gaddafi. However, there were a lot of development projects. Like they have this great man-made river in Libya. All the water sources are in the far south of the country, where the population is all north. And so, Gaddafi had all the, aquifers and put in lines and ran all that water up north for everyone. And now that's been cut off and destroyed and disintegrated during the war. And so the getting rid of Gaddafi didn't bring a more humanitarian situation to Libya. And it seems now for the first time in a long time, maybe there is an opportunity to bring some. I'm not like a big, like, I want the Libyan police force to go out there and commit, carry out law and order, but somebody's got to get these human traffickers and put them in line. At one point, I believe like a human trafficker got arrested, and so the family was able to like kill 10 members of the whatever government's militia, and was like just demanding that they release the human traffickers. Like that's the level of chaos in the situation in Libya. And so if this ceasefire can bring some stability, that seems like a huge win. I guess I'm skeptical because I've seen these ceasefires come and go in Libya in the past.
Right.
A couple things that you had just mentioned that I want to add a couple details on was the offensive that the GNA started waging this summer against CERT. It stopped just outside of the city, which is like a city on Libya's coast, like in central Libya. And I think one of the reasons it stopped was actually threats from the Egyptian dictator General al-Sisi, saying that Egypt had drawn a red line, and that if Turkey and the GNA pushed into Sirte, Egypt had like armored tanks and everything ready to go, that they were going to roll into Libya. And so I'm not sure what impact that have. I also understand there's been change of leadership in the GNA pretty recently.
Yeah.
That the guy who was, I forget his name, the head of it,
Siraj?
yeah,
Or is that the UN
Siraj,
guy?
yeah, that guy,
Okay.
had been in charge of the government the entire, I believe, the entire time it existed. From the
Yeah.
the point early on where like it couldn't even get into like Tripoli or anywhere in Libya, and was kind of just existing there in Tunisia or off the coast in the ship. And so
Right.
maybe it's this guy stepping down that's finally created the situation where we could have a little bit of now I want to say like peace, but some room for progress. Just different people coming at the negotiation side. Do you have any idea if that's impacted it at all?
That is I need to read more into that guy, the new leader there. But I did get the impression that that had something to do with this. That like they were able to. Seems like it moved pretty quickly once that guy was, the figurehead.
Okay. And so I guess my last like comment on this has just been there's weapons have poured into Libya since this all happened.
Yeah.
At one point you have a country where there's slave trade and drone warfare going on by each sides of the war at the same time. And so there were, I think, mostly Chinese made drones that the UAE was deploying to Libya on behalf of Haftar, fighting against the GNA's drones provided by Turkey. And again, this is a country where people are dying of deprivation, people are being tortured and sold into slavery, and yet you have drone war. It's just the oddest thing that you had these two things going on planet Earth at the same time. But I think it's kind of shows what the dangers of like this global militarism is that the US has engaged in, and just starting little conflicts everywhere. And that the what arms trade does, man, they'll sell arms and waste billions of dollars on that while people starve to death and die of preventable things. I just read that the humanitarian situation in Yemen is off the charts bad now. They're saying that for children, the malnutrition is at the highest it's been in areas that they can record. Those are in the government controlled areas, by the way, not even the Houthi controlled area. And
Right.
so, just terrible, terrible stuff going on here. Where again, you have like the world's craziest technology. F-16s dropping J dams on buildings in Yemen that are just you know mud brick kind of school buildings or something like that. And that's kind of the situation there. Will, anything else on Sudan or Libya?
Yeah, I just say, like, just to piggyback on what you just said, in both Yemen and Libya, you have these massive humanitarian catastrophes caused directly by U.S. policy. Like you said, like everything happening in Libya is on Barack Obama. It was his administration that, spearheaded the whole regime change operation. And, they got into bed with these jihadist factions, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Abdul Hakim Belhaj and all these like radical kooks. And they ended up being like some of the main commanders in the anti-Gaddafi forces. I think they've sort of been marginalized since in the current GNA, but like nonetheless, these are the people that the U.S. gets into bed with, and these are the outcomes of these types of policies. They're like some of the worst humanitarian crises we see on planet Earth, and the USA doesn't have to be actively occupying the country for us to have responsibility for this. Like like we're anti-war, we're against direct, active, like bombing of a country, but they're like I don't know, certain like a limited, so-called limited intervention can have long-ranging effects. And that would be more the case in Libya, where we were more heavily involved for a shorter period of time and kind of pulled back a little bit. Yemen is a little bit different, where we've sort of been like medium level involved the entire time.
Well, all right. Let's move on to a country where there was a regime change that the U.S. didn't get involved in pretty recently, which is an interesting event when that happens. And then, the fallout with this Israel normalization deal. So, I believe within the past, I think it was in 2019, that the people of Sudan really rose up and overthrew the longtime dictator Bashir. This is the guy that was in power when Osama bin Laden was running around Sudan, and the USS Cole was bombed, and Sudan ended up being put on the state sponsor of terror around that. But anyways, the people rose up and got rid of him, even though it cost them a lot of lives. The protest movement suffered a couple mass atrocities, at least by the government, including one time they just went through a camp and killed dozens of people. Horrible, horrible stuff like that. The people were really, the enemies of the government, and they rose up and got rid of it. Now, whenever they rose up, there was a military council that I think, was probably very involved in kicking Bashir out of power, and then a civilian council that kind of came together and over months of protests formed a loose, I don't know if you like a transitional government. They're supposed to have elections in a couple of years to do something more permanent, but you have this transitional government where I think the military has a little bit more of the ultimate power. But it does seem like Sudan has gone from a situation in the past year and a half of, I don't know, less freedom to more freedom is a way to say it, but definitely the people seem to have a little bit more control over what the government is doing. And so then that happens, and the Trump administration seems to more or less not get too involved in the coup attempt there. It was rumored that Saudi Arabia was backing different figures that they saw as being sympathetic, and I believe the current leadership is sympathetic to Saudi Arabia. But then the U.S. has been trying to push Sudan into doing a couple things. One is to normalize relations with Israel, and the other one is to make this payout of, I believe, $335 million to what the U.S. says are U.S. victims of terrorism perpetrated by the Sudanese state. And so, with the money, I found this to be really appalling. It seemed like extortion of a far poorer country that no longer had the government that was in place at the time that these rulings were made for. So Bashir was out of power. That's the guy that if you're gonna make somebody pay $335 million, would be the government, the guy that has to pay. But now that he's out of power and been overthrown, you have this like new coming government, and yet you're again going to extort them out of a significant amount of money for the Sudanese government. Um, and so they end up paying that, and then signing on to normalizing relations with Israel, and joining the UAE and Bahrain in what they're calling the Abraham Accords. And so this is, I think, created a destable or a more destable situation in Sudan, which is a country with, again, a very new, a budding new government that could potentially end up being better than the government they had before in Sudan. So, Will, did I miss any details? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe piggyback, I guess we can start with like the deal itself. Like, as far as I understand, the agreement itself doesn't actually do all that much beyond like restoring diplomatic ties between Sudan and Israel. I think it does lay out some intentions to like resume trade, and I think that they've even discussed that further since they've inked this thing. But otherwise, I think it was a fairly simple agreement. Like, I don't think it had any even concrete language about like opening up embassies in each other's countries. But maybe that stuff's supposed to come in like subsequent deals. But nonetheless, I think it was last Friday the Sudanese and the Israelis did agree to normalize, and Sudan I think became the third Arab state to do so in the last couple of months. And I actually had to check that. I wasn't really sure if Sudan is an Arab country, but they do apparently have an Arab majority. So I guess they do qualify as the third Arab country to normalize relations, which I think is a pretty big deal given like the history of the Arab-Israeli relations in the region. But maybe we can swing back to that in a minute. I wanted to get to the stuff because you're talking about this transitional council and how that's really that's the government in charge who inked this deal. But one possible problem with all this is the fact that they don't really have a functioning legislature right now. Like they have that temporary transitional thing that they propped up after the coup. But recently, right after this deal was announced, some major political parties in Sudan are like outraged about this deal, and they're saying it's totally illegitimate and they don't recognize it and they won't accept it. And like I think the head of their largest political party, this guy Sadiq Al-Mahdi, who's I think himself a former prime minister. He may have even been the last actually elected leader of Sudan. I'm not sure when he was in power, but he's also come out and rejected the deal. He said it violates Sudanese law, and he says it like totally screws up the current peace process, for Palestine and resolving the occupation and all that. And then you've also had some senior officials in Khartoum coming out, including I think the acting foreign minister, who are also saying that this agreement has to be approved by a legislative council. But the problem is they have not. I don't think they've created the legislative council yet. They just have this transitional thing, and so this could this could spell problems for this normalization deal. That like some factions are saying that like no, this needs to be like ratified or approved by a legislature, and they don't quite have like a functioning legislature working yet. So this could mean the deal falls apart, but it might just mean that like it has to wait until Sudan works out its like constitutional issues and figures out its legislature and how to run its post-coup government, sort of on a more permanent basis. So there is a chance it could fall through, but that stuff might just be sort of like a temporary, obstacle to the deal.
Yeah. So, is there anything else on like that end, the background of Sudan, to get into, Will?
No, I did have some stuff on just like what it could mean, what it might mean for the Palestinians and their position on this. But go ahead with what did you want to say?
Oh, I was gonna kind of go in that same direction, and first, just again highlight that you have here a country, people that are trying to put in a government that you would think the U.S. would prefer, that is probably going to be at least less sympathetic to the terrorists than Bashir was, right? And install a government that's more representative of the people and everything like that. Yet the U.S. is meddling in it just so Donald Trump could rack up an election win here before, the election in now a week. I think is big, and something that could be really used to attack him. I mean, when I was in high school, everybody was talking about Darfur, and oh, you don't know about this genocide and stuff going on. Well, this was in Sudan, and was a genocide carried out by the government in fighting against rebel groups there. And so this is a country that could go very wrong very quick, and to meddle in it over again an election victory is just silly. It seems to me. I think the deal is more substantial for Israel, and maybe I could talk a little bit about what I think the Israel what they're trying to do here. And there's a really good article that we ran this week at antiwar.com. I will link to it in the show notes page, by JP Solet. I think is how you say his name.
Sotilli? JP Sotilli?
Yeah. There you go. Thank you, Will. You got the writers down better than me, and I actually right there. But so what JP argues is that these are the outside in, is what he calls them, accords. And essentially, Israel is now removing Palestinians' Arab allies to essentially force the Palestinians to accept a deal. For a long time, the idea has been that Israel will make a deal with the Palestinians, and when the Palestinians accept it, the other Arab countries will have to go along with it and recognize Israel and all that, because when the Palestinians voice that this is what we want, it seems like the other Arab countries would kind of just politically have to go along with that. Well, now they're just stripping away all of the countries who would stand up for Palestine, so the Palestinians will feel forced to just comply with whatever Israel wants them to do. So we'll seem to have a little bit on this, so I'll let you talk about more.
Yeah, man, you said it. That was like the exact point I was going to make. That like the Arab Peace Initiative, like the thing that's been backed by a lot of countries in the region for a while now, that does sort of rely on like a lot of the Arab countries withholding their recognition of Israel. That like they can't give that before the Palestinians get before the occupation is resolved, the refugee issue is resolved, Jerusalem is resolved. There's so many things, so many outstanding issues. The settlements. There's all kinds of things they have to figure out first. And if all these Arab states start recognizing and normalizing ties with the Israelis, there's going to be a lot less pressure on them to figure these things out with the Palestinians, and they're just kind of be left high and dry. Um, without the support. And now it is certainly true that a lot of Arab states have lately just like paid lip service to the Palestinians. It's not like they've really pursued, they've not held Israel's feet to the fire to try to get them to, to make good with them. But nonetheless, like this is just going to be less pressure the more and more regional states that start making friends with the Israelis. And with Sudan, it's a kind of interesting because they're kind of different from the UAE and Bahrain. Because I think Sudan was actually still in some kind of formal, like lingering state of war with the Israelis, in sort of the way that like the Korean War is still like in force technically, because like the Arab League summit that was held after the '67 war was held in Khartoum, in the capital of Sudan. And they were one of the countries that was very vocally saying at that summit that we will never normalize relations with the Israelis, and we will always be at war with them until they, figure this out with the Palestinians. And so, like Sudan, I think up until just like last week, I think that's been their position this whole time, that they are technically in some state of war with the Israelis. And so now that they've sort of made nice with Tel Aviv, that might be kind of symbolic, even if it might not like I don't think it's going to mean any big U.S. weapons deals or anything like really geopolitically significant. But nonetheless, this is sort of the symbolic blow to the Palestinians, and they have denounced all of the recent peace initiatives with Bahrain or I don't know if peace is the right normalization initiatives with Bahrain and the UAE and Sudan. And Palestinian officials have called the Sudan deal like the next stab in the back or a new stab in the back. And so that's like they're very much opposed to this.
Yep. Well, I mean, that sounds about like all I had on it, other than you know just the fact that this is all kind of for election propaganda. I think. I guess
Right.
the Israelis benefit some, but really, I think Trump's the election benefit. And well, I mean, do you think he gets that elusive deal with Saudi Arabia before next Tuesday, and claims to bring peace to the Middle East with a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, or do this? I don't know why Saudis would do it after. I mean, it seems like all the pressure and the motivation would be to do it before the election, to buy that goodwill and influence with Trump. And I'm guessing that they all, wouldn't mind a Biden presidency. I think it's kind of like, when we were talking in 2016 leading up to the election, saying that, look, I'm sure the Saudis will be fine if Trump's president, but I mean, they've donated a lot of money to the Clinton Foundation, so they probably want their bribes to work in a certain way. So I guess I could see it to where, Israel and Saudi Arabia have a common cause in getting down Trump reelected. I think he's probably the for them the best president for either of their policies. And I wonder if they will, try to help him get reelected by signing this deal before the end of the year.
Yeah, I guess that's certainly not impossible. I'm not super like I don't think that's necessarily an imminent thing happening. But Trump was just I think just earlier today bragging that he said I think 9 or 10 other countries in the region want to sign normalization deals. This list keeps growing. I think before he was saying like 1 or 2, now it's 9 or 10 that he's saying. So it sounds like he's really trying to sell up that like look at all this great diplomacy I'm doing just before the election. But I guess it is possible that that'll be his big his big diplomatic success that he can tout. But the time's running out, man. He's only got like a week. How long can he really campaign and sell this if he were to get such a thing accomplished? How long can he really sell that for? I'm not sure how much that would really tip the scales. But one other thing I wanted to say, you were talking about how the Saudis, like, they might be fine with the Biden administration. It was hilarious. In the Reuters write-up of covering the Sudan deal. Trump is doing like a joint press conference with Netanyahu, and he's like putting Netanyahu on the spot in front of reporters, saying like, "You don't think Biden could negotiate such a great deal like with the as I did? Do you think?" And Netanyahu's like, the way Reuters quotes him, they leave like the ums and uhs in there because of how awkward it was. Netanyahu's like I think we could figure out any deal with any American leader. It was just hilariously awkward. So I love that.
Oh man, Trump has given us some great moments. You had to appreciate a president who will call the leader of Egypt his favorite dictator. Like there is something like dark and twisted about it because of the crimes that al-Sisi has committed as leader. But the Obama administration made it so that al-Sisi could take power in Egypt, and you know Obama never called al-Sisi his favorite dictator, so nobody even ever bothered to notice that the leader of Egypt was like a cruel dictator. And here Trump is, just slaps him on his back like he's an old buddy. Hey, how's my favorite dictator? And that like at least gets people to notice a little bit that like, hey, there's a real bad dude in charge of Egypt now. Geez, I wonder how he got there. No. All right, well, I guess with that we should wrap the show up. And remind everybody to find the show on Twitter. The show is at @con_interest. Or you can follow me and Will on Twitter. Will is at the Will Porter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone_. On Facebook, we are just Conflicts of Interest. Same on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe. And last, check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/conflicts of interest. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. See you, everybody.